Marie Antoinette didn't just lose her head, she lost 8 children. 4 she bore, 4 she chose, and most of them vanished so completely that even history forgot to write them down. You probably know her as the spoiled queen who said, "Let them eat cake," a line she never uttered. In truth, the woman blamed for bankrupting France spent her short life trying to mother the children no one else wanted. But sure, let's keep her as the villain. Tonight, we're not at a guillotine. We're in the candlelit corridors of Versailles, where perfume hides decay and compassion gets you executed. Before we begin, what time is it where you are? I'm always curious to map out our little empire of insomniacs. And if you love these stories, subscribe now, or you'll never find this channel again. Now close your eyes. The air smells of roses and dust. And a queen is about to learn that being a mother was far more dangerous than being a monarch. You're 14 years old, and your entire life has just been packed into a trunk and shipped across Europe. Your family waves goodbye, your dog is taken away, and your name, Marie Antoinette, is declared too Austrian for France. You're told you'll be called Marie Antoinette now because apparently even your vowels must be French. The year is 1770, and you're being sent to marry a boy you've never met. He's 16, shy, and happens to be next in line for the throne of France. You're not moving for love or adventure. You're moving because your mother, Empress Maria Theresa, decided your body was the bridge between empires. It's less a marriage and more an international business merger, sealed not with affection, but with politics and powdered wigs. Your arrival at the French border is a ceremony of transformation. Every stitch of Austrian fabric is stripped from you. Your attendants are sent home. You're redressed, recoiffed, rebranded as a perfect little Bourbon doll. Even your dog is confiscated, because heaven forbid the future Queen of France travel with a foreign pet. When you cross the bridge into France, you're already half ghost, half idea. A diplomatic offering wearing perfume. And Versailles, the place you're meant to call home, is waiting with open arms and sharper knives. Versailles is dazzling, of course. Gilded ceilings, endless mirrors, fountains that look like they were designed by someone allergic to subtlety. But beneath the glitter lies rot. It's a world where gossip has more power than government, and etiquette is a form of warfare. Every bow, every glance, every fold of silk carries the weight of 1,000 jealous eyes. You're too young to realize it, but you've been thrown into a pit of smiling wolves who can't wait to tear you apart. Politely, of course. The courtiers call you the little Austrian. Not endearingly. They mean it the way people say cute before they eat something smaller than them. Your husband, Louis, is a kind but hopeless boy. He prefers hunting, reading manuals about locks, and fixing clocks. When he's not doing that, he's avoiding you, not because he hates you, but because he has no idea what to do with you. The entire country is waiting for you two to produce an heir, and when that doesn't happen, it becomes a national crisis. 7 years of marriage and no baby. 7 years of whispers, pamphlets, caricatures. The court treats it like a scandal, as if fertility were a spectator sport. No one considers that Louis might simply be mechanically confused. France expected a miracle from a teenager who barely understood French and got cranky when she didn't deliver on schedule. You spend those years performing the role of queen-in-waiting. Your mornings begin with strangers dressing you. Dozens of nobles line up to help with your stockings, corset, and gown, because status at Versailles is measured by how close you get to the royal underwear. There's an exact order to who hands you what, and God help anyone who passes you the wrong sleeve. Personal privacy? That's for peasants. You're expected to exist publicly, eat publicly, sleep publicly, give birth publicly. You are less a person than a spectacle, and everyone, from the lowest maid to the highest duchess, is waiting for you to fail. Your letters to your mother are filled with nervous apologies. You promise to do better, to please your husband, to be worthy of your crown. Her responses are kind, but always contain a dagger. Remember, my daughter, your duty is to give France an heir. No pressure. The palace doctors gossip about your womb. Pamphleteers invent rumors about your lovers, none of which exist. And when you smile too much, they say you're shallow. When you frown, they call you cold. You can't win, and worse, you're starting to realize the game was rigged before you even arrived. So you adapt. You learn to play the part. You perfect the French bow. You speak carefully, smile strategically, and laugh only when it's politically safe. You spend hours at your dressing table while hairdressers construct towers of powdered curls that could double as artillery. You wear gowns so wide they could knock over furniture, which frankly would be the most interesting thing to happen at court all week. You attend endless dinners, nod at endless flattery, and practice the one skill Versailles prizes most, pretending you're not bored out of your mind. But beneath all that powder and lace, something else is forming. Loneliness. It's quiet, almost invisible, but it grows a little each day. You look around and realize that everyone in this palace serves you, but no one actually knows you. You're surrounded by hundreds of people, and yet completely alone. So you start to dream of small things: laughter, friendship, affection not tied to politics. You want to be loved, but in Versailles, love is the least fashionable thing of all. Eventually, you find a small escape, a private retreat built for you behind the royal gardens, the Petit Trianon. It's nothing like the palace. No glitter, no ceremony, just flowers, animals, and peace. You take off your crown, wear cotton dresses, and feed chickens with your own hands. It's childish and innocent, and precisely the kind of thing that makes everyone at court furious. A queen playing shepherdess? Scandalous. They call you wasteful, detached, frivolous. They invent stories about secret affairs and wild parties. In reality, you're just breathing for the first time in years. But the myth of Madame Deficit sells better than the truth. And the truth, that you're simply tired, isn't glamorous enough for France. The more they mock you, the more you withdraw. The court wants a polished statue, but what they get instead is a real girl trying to carve out a human life in a golden cage. You try to find meaning in small kindnesses. You send food to orphanages, pay dowries for poor girls, sponsor musicians, and fund hospitals. None of it matters. History doesn't care about compassion when it comes wrapped in diamonds. And so, the world keeps spinning, a little crueler, a little louder, until something begins to stir inside you that no gossip can touch. Hope. Not for power or wealth, but for family. The courtiers don't know it yet, but everything is about to change. Because behind all the wigs, the rumors, and the powdered facades, the lonely girl from Vienna is about to become a mother, and not in the way anyone expects. That instinct to protect, to nurture, to love something small and helpless, it's been there from the start. It's what made her different from everyone else in Versailles. It's what will one day destroy her. But before she gives birth to a princess, before the heirs, Before the revolution, it begins with one boy, a child who doesn't belong to her by blood or title, a child who almost died in the road one afternoon until a royal carriage stopped and a lonely queen looked out the window and saw herself reflected in a pair of frightened eyes, which is exactly what she did. And her first child wasn't royal at all. One afternoon, long before the guillotine, long before the mobs, long before the rumors of diamonds and debauchery, a royal carriage rattled down a dusty road near Versailles. The horses were restless, the guards were bored, and the queen inside, Marie Antoinette, was, as usual, being paraded through her kingdom like an exotic animal that needed constant observation. The crowd pressed in on both sides of the road. Peasants waved half-heartedly. Children ran alongside the wheels, curious, maybe hungry, maybe both. And then, in a blur of dust and motion, one of those children stumbled forward, right into the path of the royal carriage. The horses reared. The driver shouted. The guards lunged. But before anyone could react, a woman's voice rang out from inside. "Stop!" The carriage jerked to a halt, wheels grinding against the road. In the silence that followed, you could hear a child sobbing. The queen leaned forward, silk rustling, and looked out the window. There, on the ground, was a small boy, dirty, barefoot, terrified, his hand scraped, his face streaked with mud and tears. He couldn't have been more than 7. Now, most royals would have ignored the scene entirely. France was full of peasants. One more or less made little difference. But Marie wasn't most royals. Maybe she recognized something of herself in him, a child caught beneath the wheels of something too big to understand. Or maybe she was simply tired of feeling powerless and saw a chance to do one kind thing in a life made of ceremonies. Either way, she opened the carriage door herself, stepped down in her pale shoes, and asked the boy his name. He couldn't speak for a moment. No one had ever spoken to him, let alone a queen. When he finally stammered it out, François Michel Gagné, she smiled and nodded as if it were the most noble name she'd ever heard. Then, to the shock of every horrified courtier present, she ordered her attendants to bring the boy to Versailles. "He will not beg again," she said. "He is under my protection." And just like that, history gained a strange little footnote. The day the Queen of France adopted a peasant child she almost ran over. The palace, predictably, lost its collective mind. The courtiers whispered that the queen had finally gone mad. Some thought it was a publicity stunt. Others assumed it was another of her Austrian eccentricities, like smiling too much or pretending she cared about poor people. The servants tried to hide their laughter behind curtsies. "Some people adopt dogs," one of them muttered. "Marie Antoinette adopts stray peasants." But she meant it. The boy, whom she began calling Armand, was bathed, fed, and clothed in fine linen. He was educated alongside the children of noble tutors, taught to read, to write, to bow. For the first time in his short life, he slept on a mattress instead of straw. Versailles had given him more than a home. It had given him a strange kind of captivity wrapped in kindness. You can imagine how confusing that must have been for him. One week he's scrounging for bread. The next he's eating pastries dusted with sugar under a ceiling covered in gold. Servants appear when he sneezes. Guards open doors he's afraid to touch. It was charity disguised as luxury, and while the queen meant it as salvation, the boy soon learned that comfort could be its own form of prison. Marie Antoinette adored him, of course. She loved children, any children really, and her maternal instincts were ferocious in a world that constantly reminded her she hadn't yet fulfilled her royal duties. She called him Mon Petit Armand, her little Armand, and showed him off to her ladies as proof that she could do good. that she wasn't just a doll in silk. He followed her through the gardens, clutching her hand as courtiers tried not to stare. In a way, he was her first success, a living act of rebellion against the cold, mechanical heart of Versailles. But Versailles has a way of ruining even the purest gestures. As Armand grew older, he began to notice the distance between himself and everyone else. The other children he studied with, the sons of dukes, the daughters of marquises, played with him politely, but not sincerely. Servants still bowed when he passed, but they bowed differently, with that small, cruel hesitation reserved for people who don't quite belong. Even the queen's affection had limits. She loved him, yes, but he wasn't her blood. And in a palace obsessed with lineage, that meant he would always be tolerated, never accepted. He must have felt the weight of that every day. The lessons, the dinners, the polite laughter, it was all borrowed light. When he looked out the palace windows toward the horizon, he could see the world he came from. Fields, cottages, children who still ran barefoot through mud. It must have whispered to him at night, reminding him where he truly belonged. Years later, when the first riots broke out in Paris, Armand was no longer the frightened child from the road. He was a young man, restless and angry, caught between two worlds, too royal for the peasants, too common for the royals. The queen who had once rescued him was now the enemy of the people, and he, who had once eaten at her table, now watched from the streets as the crowd chanted for her death. Some say he joined the revolution. Others claim he was seen among the mob that stormed the palace gates. Whether or not that's true, history records one tragic fact. Armand died young, a casualty of the same unrest that would soon devour his adoptive mother. It's hard not to see the bitter irony in that. The boy she pulled from the road would eventually be swallowed by the same road's chaos. Her first act of love ended in betrayal, not because he hated her, but because the world forced him to choose a side. In the end, he chose survival, and survival in 18th century France had very little room for sentiment. Marie Antoinette never spoke publicly of him again. The court certainly didn't. When her enemies accused her of selfishness, of greed, of ignoring the poor, she could have mentioned Armand, this boy she saved, clothed, educated, loved. But she didn't. Maybe she thought no one would believe her. Or maybe she'd learned that kindness, once politicized, turned sour in the retelling. Today, his name survives only in scraps of letters and the faintest mentions in dusty archives. François Michel Gagné, Armand, the first child she ever called hers, forgotten by both the monarchy that adopted him and the revolution that consumed him. If you listen closely, you can almost imagine him, standing on that same road years later, the smell of gunpowder and bread thick in the air, remembering the queen who once stopped a carriage for him. Maybe he smiled at the memory, or maybe he turned away and kept walking, because no one in France could afford to look back anymore. Either way, his story ends the way so many of hers will, in silence. A queen's kindness scattered in the wind, a boy's gratitude lost to history, both erased by the same wheel that almost crushed him that day. And for Marie, it was only the beginning, the first flicker of motherhood, the first time she tried to save a child, and learned how dangerous love could be in a world that despised it. And if you're still here, still listening to the story everyone else forgot, then maybe don't vanish like they did. Subscribe, so at least one of us remembers them. It's May 1778, and the air in Versailles feels like it's holding its breath. Every corridor hums with gossip. Every duchess, every servant, every gardener knows the same thing. The queen is finally in labor. After 7 long, humiliating years of speculation, the moment France has been waiting for has arrived. And because this is Versailles, where privacy is a myth and spectacle is a religion, the birth of the royal child is a public event. You can hear them even from the royal bedchamber. The scraping of shoes, the murmur of silk, the shuffle of 200 courtiers elbowing for space. It's less a birth than a theater performance, and the queen, pale and exhausted, is the unwilling star. She had begged for privacy, but kings and queens don't get that luxury. A monarch's womb is not her own. It belongs to France, and France wants proof. The room is suffocatingly hot. The curtains are drawn back, the candles flare, and every eye is fixed on her bed. Her ladies flutter around like anxious birds, fanning her face, whispering prayers. The doctors are sweating through their wigs. Someone faints, not the queen, but a spectator overcome by the honor of witnessing history. And Marie, gripping the sheets, does the one thing that still terrifies everyone at court. She screams. After hours that feel like centuries, the cries change, smaller now, higher, fragile. A baby's wail cuts through the gold and perfume. The room explodes into applause. The queen collapses back against the pillows, tears in her eyes. She's done it. She's finally given France what it demanded. And then, as the physician lifts the newborn and proudly announces it's a girl, the applause falters. The silence that follows is cruelly loud. France had been waiting for a son, an heir, a dauphin. The newspapers had already prepared the headlines. The court had already chosen the christening gifts. And now, a daughter. A disappointment swaddled in silk. Someone in the back mutters a polite, "Vive la reine." But the enthusiasm is gone. The duchesses exchange pitying looks. The courtiers start whispering again, already calculating how to spin the news without offending anyone important. The doctors bow and step aside, relieved but unimpressed. And through all of it, Marie Antoinette, still trembling, still flushed with exhaustion, looks at the tiny bundle in her arms and smiles. "You were not the son they wanted," she whispers, "but you will be the daughter I need." The baby is named Marie Thérèse Charlotte, after her grandmother, Empress Maria Theresa. From her first breath, she is treated not as a miracle, but as a placeholder, a reminder that the real prize has yet to arrive. Yet for her mother, she is everything. From that day forward, something in the queen changes. The young, frivolous girl, obsessed with fashion and music, begins to soften into something else. A mother. A real one. You can see it in the way she holds the child, the way she smiles more freely, the way she stops caring, at least a little, about the endless pettiness of court life. For years, she had been accused of being cold, distant, artificial, and yet here she was, pressing kisses onto a baby's forehead, her wig askew, her jewels forgotten. The courtiers didn't know what to make of it. Some found it touching. Others called it unqueenly. After all, queens were meant to rule, not cradle. Imagine giving birth in front of a crowd and still being accused of being cold. Versailles really did have a gift for missing the point. The days that followed were a blur of ceremony. Every moment of Marie Therese's existence had to be documented, announced, celebrated. The palace erupted with official visits, congratulations, and gifts. Nobles paraded through her nursery, pretending to admire the baby while sneaking glances at the queen's waistline, wondering how soon she could try again. Marie smiled through all of it, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the window, toward the gardens, toward air that wasn't scented with politics. When the doors finally closed and the noise subsided, she would rock her daughter quietly, humming Austrian lullabies no one else in France understood. Sometimes she cried, not because she was sad, but because for the first time she wasn't pretending to be someone else. The baby in her arms didn't care about court etiquette, didn't demand witty conversation, didn't judge her accent. She just needed warmth. And for a woman who'd been treated like a piece of international furniture since the age of 14, that was enough to make her feel human again. Her husband, Louis, was awkward but affectionate. He adored the baby in his own timid way, though his relief at producing something that cried and breathed was obvious. He visited the nursery often, shyly holding the infant while Marie watched, amused by his clumsy tenderness. For a while, they looked like an ordinary couple. Almost. But outside the nursery, the world continued its endless noise. The pamphlets didn't stop. The gossip didn't rest. The same crowds who had once demanded an heir now mocked her for being un-French, for spending too much money, for smiling too easily, for being too soft. There was no winning, not for a foreign queen. And yet, for the first time, she seemed not to care. Something had shifted. In the mornings, instead of rushing to the salons or gambling tables, she spent hours with Marie-Thérèse, reading, playing, talking to her as if she were a friend rather than a symbol. The palace nannies called her indulgent. The courtiers whispered that she was becoming sentimental. But if Versailles demanded a heartless monarch, Marie was determined to be something far more dangerous. A woman who cared. It didn't take long for word to spread that the queen had changed. The same nobles who mocked her for childish laughter now accused her of being too maternal, as if compassion itself were treasonous. When she retreated to the Petit Trianon with her baby, they called her selfish. When she took her daughter into her arms at public events, they called her inappropriate. And yet, even her harshest critics couldn't ignore the simple truth. For the first time, she seemed genuinely happy. Years later, when people tried to reduce her life to a single cruel quote about cake, they missed this moment, this quiet, stubborn act of love. They missed the young woman who, under crushing pressure and endless scrutiny, looked down at a newborn girl and chose to love her anyway. Marie-Thérèse would grow up to be strong, proud, and scarred by history. But on that day in 1778, she was just a small, perfect child in her mother's trembling arms, a symbol of grace in a world that had forgotten what it looked like. And for Marie Antoinette, it was the first real victory of her life, one that didn't require applause or approval or ceremony. Just a heartbeat, a lullaby, and the quiet understanding that even in Versailles, love could still exist. It wouldn't last, of course. In a few years, another child would come, a son this time, and the applause would return along with the weight of expectation. But that's a story for later. For now, picture her in that grand, stifling room, eyes closed, cradling the child everyone called a disappointment. To her, she was nothing less than salvation. It's October 1781, and for once Versailles smells like victory. Bells are ringing across France. Fireworks explode over the palace gardens. Bakers are ordered to hand out free bread, because after years of waiting, after all the mockery and speculation and pamphlets, the Queen of France has finally given birth to a boy. The Dauphin, the heir. The small, squirming bundle that would one day be king. At least, that's what everyone believes. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief ripple through the corridors. France has an heir. The dynasty is secure. The courtiers beam like proud grandparents. The nobles compose poems comparing the infant's birth to the rising of the sun. Someone even faints from joy, which is impressive given how much perfume is already competing for attention in that room. Marie Antoinette is radiant, exhausted but radiant. For years, she's been accused of failing her duty, of being barren, frivolous, foreign. And now she holds in her arms the ultimate political apology, a healthy boy. Louis-Joseph Xavier François, Dauphin of France. The name is long enough to require its own carriage, but that's how you know he's important. Outside, the city rejoices. Church bells echo through Paris. Crowds gather at taverns to toast the royal birth with cheap wine. The government even opens the palace gates so the people can share in the celebrations. The same people who will later storm those gates, of course, but that's 8 years away. For now, they cheer. Inside the nursery, the Queen's smile is softer. She's holding the baby close, brushing his downy hair with her fingertips. It's the kind of love Versailles doesn't understand. Quiet, genuine, unperformative. For once, she's not thinking about politics or etiquette, just warmth, breath, and the faint heartbeat against her chest. Louis XVI is beside her, awkward and proud. He looks down at the tiny figure and says the kind of thing only a man who's read too many state papers could think of. France is happy today. Marie laughs. France can wait, she says. He's sleeping. For a while, life at Versailles almost resembles something normal. The Queen spends her mornings in the nursery, her afternoons in the gardens, her evenings reading to the baby in broken French lullabies she half remembers from her own childhood. The boy is adored by everyone, nurses, courtiers, even his tutors, who take turns predicting how wise and noble he'll be when he's older. But Versailles has never been kind to children. Not really. Its air is thick with drafts and politics, and neither are good for a baby. By the time he's 6, Louis-Joseph starts coughing. At first, it's nothing alarming. Children catch colds, even royal ones. But the cough lingers. He grows pale, restless. The palace doctors, eager to appear competent, begin offering advice like confetti. One prescribes more sunlight. Another demands leeches. A third insists on horseback exercise because nothing says medical innovation like making a feverish child ride through the woods. They mean well, of course, but competence has never been Versailles' strong suit. They poke, prod, and bleed him until he's too weak to protest. His small body, once rosy and bright, begins to curve slightly, his spine twisting under the invisible weight of disease. Tuberculosis of the spine, they'll call it later. But back then, it was just a mystery, a royal mystery, which meant it had to be treated with pomp instead of science. Marie Antoinette tries everything. She summons physicians from Paris, Vienna, even Italy. None of them can do more than bow, mutter in Latin, and suggest expensive treatments that accomplish nothing. She watches him fade day by day, and for the first time in her life, the palace feels small, the chandeliers too bright, the laughter too loud, the luxury suddenly meaningless. You can picture her sitting by his bed, reading stories he's too tired to finish. His toys, once scattered across the nursery, now lie untouched. The courtiers, always uncomfortable with real emotion, start avoiding the room entirely. When they do come, they speak in whispers, as if grief is contagious. The boy is gentle, brave, and heartbreakingly polite. Even when he's in pain, he thanks his nurses. When his mother cries beside him, he tells her not to be sad, that he'll be fine soon, that God will help him. He's 7 years old and already trying to comfort a woman who can command armies. And then, as summer turns to storm, he grows weaker. By the spring of 1789, the palace knows he will not recover. The doctors stop pretending. Marie stops sleeping. France, meanwhile, is unraveling outside her walls. Bread is scarce. The people are restless. The word revolution is beginning to appear in pamphlets. But inside the Queen's chambers, there is only the sound of a small, labored breath. On June 4th, 1789, at around 8:30 in the evening, the Dauphin dies. He's 7 years old. The bells that once celebrated his birth now toll for his death. The fireworks are gone. There are no free loaves of bread this time. The court falls into ceremonial mourning, but the people of Paris barely notice. They're too busy shouting in the streets. A week later, the Bastille will fall, and France will begin tearing itself apart. He missed the revolution by a week. Talk about timing. For the Queen, it's more than a tragedy. It's a cruel symmetry. The child who was supposed to secure her legacy dies just as the world begins dismantling it. All her efforts, all her prayers, reduced to a whisper in the chaos. They bury him quietly, far from the palace, in a ceremony stripped of grandeur. The courtiers murmur their condolences, already thinking about their own safety. In the months that follow, she walks through the nursery like a ghost. The room is silent now, the bed neatly made, the windows shut against the noise of a city that no longer belongs to her. She keeps a small lock of his hair in a locket, tucked against her heart, even as the mob begins to gather outside Versailles. When the storm finally breaks, when she's forced to flee with her remaining children, she will still carry that locket, through the palace gates, through the crowds, through the endless march toward her own destruction. They'll call her extravagant, selfish, detached. They'll invent new insults, new caricatures, new reasons to hate her. But they'll never see her as she is now, a mother grieving in silence, holding a tiny lock of hair, whispering to a child who never got the chance to grow up. And for once, there's no sarcasm that fits. Just a truth too quiet for history books. He died before the revolution began, and maybe that was mercy. It's March 1785, and for a brief fleeting moment, there is still laughter in Versailles. The chandeliers burn bright again. The courtiers have something to gossip about that isn't revolution or bread shortages, and the Queen, so often accused of vanity and indifference, is smiling like someone who's forgotten she's supposed to be careful about it. Her second son has just been born. A healthy boy, strong lungs, loud enough to drown out the rumors that had haunted her since her last loss. His name is Louis Charles, the new Dauphin of France. To the world, he's a symbol. To Marie Antoinette, he's redemption. She calls him her chou d'amour, her darling cabbage. And for a little while, that small boy manages to make the Queen of France forget she's also the most hated woman in Europe. You can picture the scene. The royal nursery glowing with morning light, soft laughter echoing through gold-trimmed halls. The boy is beautiful, quick to smile, quick to run, quick to fill the palace with a kind of joy Versailles hasn't seen in years. Even Louis XV, awkward and lumbering as ever, seems lighter when he's with his son. The courtiers watch and whisper that perhaps the monarchy has been blessed again. But outside those palace walls, France has already begun to boil. The world that Louis Charles was born into, the world of powdered wigs and perfect manners, is cracking. The cost of war, of debt, of excess has drained the treasury dry. The people are angry, hungry, and dangerously aware that their king and queen live surrounded by food and flowers while they starve. Inside the nursery, though, there's no hunger, no noise. Just a mother teaching her son to say his prayers, a father watching awkwardly from the doorway. A small moment of peace in a palace already haunted by the sound of distant drums. And then, in 1789, the drums arrive. The boy is 4 when his brother, Louis Joseph, dies. Overnight, the laughing toddler becomes heir to a kingdom that's already collapsing. The courtiers address him as Monseigneur le Dauphin. The people in the streets have a different name for him, the son of tyranny. The palace grows colder. The crowds outside louder. Marie Antoinette's letters grow shorter, her handwriting tighter, her sentences more desperate. And through it all, Louis Charles, small and wide-eyed, clings to her skirts, sensing what even the adults can't yet say aloud. By 1791, the family has fled Versailles. The palace that once sparkled with gold now stands empty, its mirrors reflecting only dust and memory. They move to Paris, to the Tuileries Palace, a prison masquerading as a home. Guards at every door, whispers in every corner. The boy isn't allowed to play in the gardens anymore. There are no more music lessons, no more laughter echoing through marble halls. Just confinement and waiting. And then comes the night that ends any illusion of safety, the flight to Varennes. The plan is simple. Escape the city, reach the border, regroup. The queen disguises herself as a governess. The king dresses like a servant. The children, sleepy and confused, are wrapped in blankets and told they're going on a journey. You can imagine it. The carriage bumping over rough country roads, the air thick with tension. The little boy asks where they're going, and someone whispers, "To a safer place." But safety is a luxury they no longer own. When they're discovered and dragged back to Paris, the mob jeers at the queen, spits at the carriage, shouts insults she shields her children from hearing. Louis Charles presses his face into her shoulder, trembling. The boy who once waved at parades now hides from the crowd. The years that follow are a slow descent into darkness. In 1793, the king is executed. The boy is 7. He isn't told immediately. When he finally asks where his father has gone, no one has the courage to answer. A few months later, his mother is taken from him too, dragged from the prison cell they share, and sent to the guillotine. The guards tell him he's now the king of France. He's 8 years old, sitting alone in a tower room, surrounded by men who call him Majesty, while treating him like a criminal. What happens next belongs to the ugliest part of history. The revolutionaries decide that the boy must be re-educated. They assign him to a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler turned revolutionary, whose job is to teach the child to renounce his parents and embrace liberty. The lessons are brutal. The boy is beaten, mocked, locked away. He's forced to parrot revolutionary slogans he doesn't understand. When he hesitates, the punishments get worse. In one of the most grotesque acts of the revolution, they make him testify against his own mother, forcing him to repeat lies fed to him through fear and exhaustion. The accusation, incest, is as vile as it is absurd. Marie Antoinette listens in silence at her trial as her son's coerced words are read aloud. She doesn't cry, doesn't shout. She simply says, "If I have not answered, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge." By the time she dies, her son is wasting away in a cell only a few rooms away, never told that she's gone. The guards change. The years pass. No one bothers to feed him properly anymore. He stops speaking, stops responding. The child who once played in Versailles now sits in darkness, surrounded by filth and rats, too weak to stand. The revolution that promised freedom forgets about him entirely. He dies in June 1795, age 10, alone, unburied for days. When his body is finally examined, they find scars, ulcers, and evidence of long neglect. The boy who was once the future of France has been reduced to a forgotten footnote. His small coffin is buried without ceremony, without name. For decades afterward, rumors will circulate that he escaped, that the real Dauphin was smuggled out and replaced with another child. The myth grows, century after century, as impostors across Europe claim to be him. But in 2000, science ends the guessing. A heart preserved from his autopsy, kept in a jar for over 200 years, is tested for DNA. It matches Marie Antoinette's family line. The heart belonged to Louis Charles, the lost Dauphin. The boy never escaped. He died right where they left him. So ends the brief, cruel story of France's youngest king. Born under chandeliers, died under a leaky ceiling. The revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity, except for the small, royal, and terrified. It's July 1786, and Versailles is suffocating under the weight of summer. The fountains sparkle, the air hums with heat, and the courtiers whisper with a rare kind of happiness, because once again, the queen is expecting. After 2 sons and a daughter, Marie Antoinette is about to bring another royal child into the world. The palace prepares as it always does. Nurses are summoned, silks are chosen, cradles are carved, and pamphlets are printed in advance to announce what will, of course, be another symbol of France's divine favor. Everything about this world runs on assumption, and assumption at Versailles is often wrong. The baby comes early, too early. Her name is Sophie Hélène Béatrice, and from the first moment she draws breath, everyone knows she's fighting a losing battle. Her lungs are weak. Her cry is small, barely a sound at all, more a sigh than a wail. The doctors exchange nervous glances and immediately switch to the confident tone all royal physicians must master. The one that means we don't know what we're doing, but we'll do it loudly so no one notices. They call it divine will, which in noble speak means we have no idea. Marie Antoinette is exhausted, pale, and terrified. She's been through this before. 3 healthy births, each one followed by public scrutiny, rumors, and ceremony. But this feels different. When she holds the baby for the first time, she can tell something is wrong. The infant's skin is cool. Her chest rises unevenly. The room is silent, except for the rustle of silk and the quiet, awkward shifting of doctors who have already begun preparing their excuses. Sophie is baptized immediately, as was tradition when a child's survival is uncertain. Her tiny head glistens with holy water under candlelight. The priest murmurs prayers about heaven and grace, while Marie looks down and whispers her own silent one, "Stay." It's not for politics this time, not for the throne or the dynasty. It's the prayer of a mother who's already lost too much. For a little while, the miracle seems possible. Against all odds, the baby survives her first days. The palace erupts in cautious optimism. Courtiers begin to visit the nursery again, bearing gifts and hollow congratulations. Versailles loves a good show, and nothing says, "The monarchy endures," like a royal cradle filled with lace. But this cradle comes with shadows. Sophie grows slowly. She's delicate, fragile in a way that makes even the nurses nervous to touch her. Every cough sounds dangerous. Every sleepless night feels like a countdown. Marie spends hours by her side, ignoring protocol, ignoring gossip, ignoring everything except the sound of her daughter's uneven breathing. She tells her stories in a soft voice, humming lullabies in Austrian German when she thinks no one is listening. It's a small rebellion, an echo of home, of humanity in a world that demands perfection. Louis XVI visits often, standing awkwardly at the crib's edge, his massive frame looming over the fragile bundle that represents both hope and heartbreak. He means well, as always, but he doesn't know what to say. The King of France, conqueror of nothing, can only watch his child breathe like a candle about to go out. When he does speak, it's to suggest more doctors, more prayers, more treatments. But at Versailles, too many hands often make things worse. The doctors try everything: tonics, compresses, even experimental remedies involving powdered pearls, because apparently, if you make something expensive enough, it counts as medicine. They prescribe rest, as if infants can be told to relax. One suggests that the baby be kept in a warmer room. Another insists that the air must be cooler. They contradict each other hourly, united only in their incompetence. The Queen, caught between fear and frustration, begins to retreat inward. She rarely leaves the nursery. Her ladies bring her letters, updates, invitations to balls and ceremonies, all of which she ignores. Versailles thrives on spectacle, but Marie's world has narrowed to the size of a cradle. She strokes her daughter's tiny fingers and murmurs, "You would have been my friend." And you can feel it, this quiet, aching truth. She doesn't say heir or princess or future duchess. She says friend, because after years of isolation, of mockery, of living in rooms full of people who only pretend to care, this is what she's been searching for. Not power, not fame, just connection. The baby's condition worsens in the spring of 1787. Her coughing grows sharper, her breathing thinner. Marie refuses to leave her side. She sleeps in a chair beside the crib, dozing in fits, her hand always resting near her daughter's. The palace for once goes quiet out of respect, or perhaps discomfort. Even the courtiers understand that some performances shouldn't be watched. When the end comes, it's soft. There are no screams, no doctors rushing in, no candlelight vigils. Just a faint exhale in the middle of the night, the smallest sound in a palace built to echo. Marie wakes before anyone tells her. Mothers always know. She lifts the child, still warm but already slipping away, and holds her close. No ceremony, no audience, just silence. She doesn't weep immediately. She sits for a long time, staring at the child she couldn't save. Then finally she whispers, "She would have been my friend." The words drift across the empty nursery and disappear into the lace curtains. The next morning the court resumes its rituals. Announcements are written, condolences exchanged, prayers scheduled. Versailles mourns decorously, efficiently, almost politely. But the Queen doesn't attend the ceremonies. She doesn't need to see priests pretending to care or courtiers bowing with well-rehearsed sorrow. She stays in the nursery instead, her hands folded around a lock of her daughter's hair. To the public, Sophie Hélène Béatrice will be remembered only as a small footnote, the fourth child of Marie Antoinette, who died in infancy. No scandal, no politics, no myth, just a quiet line in a history book. But to her mother, she was something else entirely. Proof that even in the grandest palace in the world, life could still be heartbreakingly fragile. And maybe, if there's a strange kind of mercy in that, it's that Sophie never saw what came next. She never heard the mobs, never saw the torches or the chains, never watched her mother dragged away. She lived her short life surrounded by love, untainted by what would follow. Still, for Marie Antoinette, the loss carved something permanent inside her. You can see it in the portraits painted afterward. The softer eyes, the forced smiles, the weight behind the pearls. She looks less like a queen and more like a woman who's learned that all the gold in the world can't buy a single heartbeat. The courtiers called it tragedy. The doctors called it divine will. But in truth, it was something much simpler, a mother and a child, both too human for the world they were born into. It's the spring of 1787, and Versailles, as always, is busy being tastelessly extravagant. The salons are full of gossip, the courtiers are bored, and somewhere between a performance and a luncheon, someone decides to give the Queen of France a gift. Not flowers, not jewelry, not even one of those small dogs that yip at powdered ankles. No, this time it's a child, a small frightened boy from Senegal, barefoot, silent, dressed in ornate livery as though his dignity were just another accessory. He's led into the Queen's presence like a novelty, the courtiers smiling in that awful, self-satisfied way that people do when they think cruelty counts as charm. The room is bright with gold and mirrors, and in the middle of it stands a child who has been stolen from his home, renamed, and presented as a kind of living decoration. They introduce him as a present for Her Majesty, because in their world, even human beings can be wrapped up like trinkets. France, of course, has already begun congratulating itself on its philosophy of liberty, a concept it likes to advertise as long as it doesn't have to apply it consistently. Marie Antoinette blinks, and for once, Versailles doesn't know what she's thinking. This is not the kind of spectacle she enjoys. She looks at the boy, his thin arms, his frightened eyes, the way he doesn't know whether to bow or run. And something breaks through the layers of silk and etiquette. You can almost imagine the silence that follows. The courtiers waiting for her to laugh or applaud or thank them for their generosity. But she doesn't. Instead, she says very quietly, "This is no gift." The boy's name is Jean Amilcar, or at least that's what history remembers him as. He's about 7, maybe 8. His real name, the one given to him before France decided to rename him, is lost. But what happens next is not. Marie Antoinette immediately orders that he be freed. No delay, no ceremony. She sends word that his status is to be changed, his care entrusted to her household, his life no longer property but person. Some of the courtiers are scandalized. Others laugh it off as another of her foreign eccentricities. The Queen, after all, has a habit of doing things that confuse polite society, like feeding orphans or visiting hospitals or having actual feelings. They whisper that she's naive, sentimental, playing shepherdess again. But she doesn't care. She calls for the royal tailor, commissions new clothes for Jean, and arranges for his education at her expense. And just like that, the most powerful woman in France, mocked as frivolous, condemned as heartless, becomes the only person in the room willing to act like a human being. Jean is given a tutor, proper meals, a bed of his own. For the first time in his life, he is free. He studies well. The Queen checks on him often, asking about his lessons, sending books and small gifts. When she walks in the gardens, he sometimes follows at a distance, shy but curious. The palace staff are unsure what to make of him, some kind, some cruel, but she protects him fiercely. To her, he's not a pet or a curiosity. He's a child, another lost soul she can mother, another small rebellion against the cruelty of her world. She has no illusions about changing France. She can't even change her husband's haircut. But she can save this one boy, and for her, that's enough. You can almost imagine her telling him stories in the nursery, his laughter mingling with that of her own children. A strange little household forming beneath the chandeliers, royal, adopted, and unacknowledged. Love, for once, not dictated by bloodlines or treaties. But kindness, in her world, rarely lasts. When the revolution begins, the palace empties. The gilded halls that once echoed with laughter turn to silence and dust. The queen is imprisoned, her jewels confiscated, her letters censored. Everything she owns, everything she loves, is stripped away. And among the first casualties of her downfall are the children she once protected. When Marie Antoinette is taken to the Tuileries, she can no longer send money or messages. Her accounts are seized, her household dismissed. The stipends that paid for Jean's education stop without explanation. The boy, barely a teenager now, finds himself suddenly alone, no longer a ward of the queen, no longer protected by her name. He leaves the school where he'd been studying. There's nowhere to go. No one willing to take in a freed black child in a country collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The revolution's leaders shout about liberty and equality, but they don't mean his liberty or his equality. France didn't mind human rights, as long as the humans looked the part. Jean wanders the outskirts of Paris, doing odd jobs when he can, begging when he can't. Some records say he tried to join a regiment. Others say he was turned away for his color. What's certain is that he dies before he becomes a man. Starvation, exposure, forgotten, no tomb, no ceremony. Just another life lost in a country too proud to admit it had never truly been free. And yet, for a few short years, he had something most people never get. A mother who saw him, not as a token or a servant, but as a child worth saving. A queen who refused to accept that kindness needed permission. It doesn't excuse her excesses or erase her privilege, but it does make the story harder to tell in black and white. When historians later write about her, they'll call her wasteful, extravagant, out of touch. They'll write paragraphs about diamonds and not a single line about Jean Amilcar. His name will vanish into the folds of time, just another whisper erased by the powdered noise of empire. But if you listen carefully, past the fireworks, past the speeches, past the myths of liberty, you can still hear the echo of one small act that defied everything Versailles stood for. A queen looked at a boy in chains and chose to see a person instead of a possession. That's not politics. That's humanity. And maybe that's why history forgot him. He didn't fit the story anyone wanted to tell. Not the revolutionaries, who couldn't admit they'd let him die. Not the monarchists, who couldn't bear to admit their queen had done something truly selfless. He slipped through the cracks, like so many children in this tale, his kindness purchased and then repossessed by a world that never learned how to value it. So tonight, let's do the one thing Versailles never could. Remember him, the boy she freed, the one who didn't live long enough to see that freedom mean anything at all. If you're still here, still awake while his name fades through history, don't let him vanish twice. Subscribe so someone remembers he lived. It's the spring of 1788, and Versailles, despite its size, has begun to feel small. The gardens are still manicured, the fountains still dance, but the laughter that once echoed through the marble halls is softer now, careful, as if even the walls have learned to whisper. The revolution hasn't yet arrived, but the air already tastes like change, metallic, uncertain, heavy. And in the middle of that gilded unease, a quiet friendship begins to bloom between two little girls. One is Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the daughter of the King and Queen of France. The other is Ernestine Lambriquet, the daughter of a palace servant. They are nearly the same age, play in the same corridors, and in time will look so alike that courtiers will whisper that they could be twins. The story starts simply enough. Ernestine's mother, a maid to the royal household, dies suddenly of illness. The queen, moved by the child's grief, brings her into her care. Marie Antoinette, by now no stranger to loss, takes the girl's hand and says, "You shall stay here." No titles, no proclamations, no paperwork, just a quiet decision from a woman who knows too well what it means to be lonely. Ernestine is given new clothes. Fine, yes, but not extravagant. The queen insists that she share Marie-Thérèse's tutors, her lessons, her meal times. The girls learn to read together, to dance, to embroider. When one is scolded, the other pouts on her behalf. They giggle behind fans during etiquette lessons, sneak sweets from the kitchen, and trade secrets whispered beneath canopies of silk. In a world obsessed with rank and protocol, their friendship feels almost rebellious. Two children allowed, briefly, to be children. To everyone else, though, it's a curiosity. A royal princess and a commoner sharing the same toys. Versailles doesn't know what to make of it. The courtiers invent stories to explain it away. Some say the queen simply wanted her daughter to understand charity. Others murmur something less kind, that Ernestine is not just a servant's child, but the secret daughter of Louis XVI himself, born of an indiscretion that decorum demanded be hidden in plain sight. It isn't true, of course. Louis XVI was many things: awkward, indecisive, perpetually confused by his own keys, but a philanderer he was not. Still, gossip in Versailles is like perfume, impossible to contain, even when it stinks. For Marie Antoinette, the rumors hardly matter. She sees in Ernestine what she saw in so many children before her: a chance to give love somewhere safe, somewhere uncomplicated. And for Marie-Thérèse, Ernestine is simply her other half. They are inseparable. When one is dressed, so is the other. When one reads, the other listens. They sit together in portraits, the line between royal and commoner blurred beneath matching ribbons. There's something quietly poignant about the two of them, like mirrors in candlelight, reflecting back versions of each other's lives. Marie-Thérèse, born into privilege she never asked for. Ernestine, living a life borrowed from another world. Both watched, both adored, both trapped in a palace that has never known privacy. Their friendship carries on, even as the world begins to fracture outside. The queen grows more anxious, her smiles tighter. The servants speak in coded tones. Bread riots begin to turn into marches. And yet, in the midst of all that noise, the girls still play in the gardens, still feed crumbs to the birds, still whisper about things that matter to no one but themselves. Ribbons, music, stories, the color of the sunset reflected in the fountains. But even fairy tales have to end. In 1789, when the revolution erupts, Versailles ceases to be a home and becomes a memory. The royal family is forced to flee to Paris, to the Tuileries Palace. Ernestine, for her safety, is left behind under the care of trusted attendants. The two girls cry as they're separated, promising to write, to meet again soon. Neither understands how completely the world is about to fall apart. In the chaos that follows, rumors multiply faster than facts. Some whisper that Ernestine has been smuggled into the royal carriage, disguised as Marie Therese's double. Others claim she replaces the princess during the family's imprisonment. Conspiracy theorists, centuries later, will spin entire myths from that shadow, insisting that Ernestine survived the revolution while the real princess perished. None of it holds up, of course, but it says something about how closely their lives had intertwined. History, confused, begins to mix their reflections. Ernestine's real story is quieter. After the royal family's downfall, she's taken in by guardians sympathetic to the crown. The world that once fed her on silver spoons now runs on suspicion and scarcity. The laughter of her childhood gives way to silence, to survival. She marries a man named Jean-Charles Germain Pompin, a clerk. They live modestly in Paris, far from the palaces where her childhood played out like a dream. She never boasts of who she once lived beside, never trades her past for sympathy or coin. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about her. She doesn't try to rewrite her place in history. She had brushed against it once, but she never clung to it. She dies in 1813 at the age of 43. No paintings commemorate her. No biographers line up to record her thoughts. But somewhere, in the small details, the embroidery patterns preserved in museum collections, the names scribbled in household ledgers, her life still flickers, faint but steady. Ernestine Lambriquet, the child who wasn't royal, but was treated as if she were. The shadow twin of Marie Thérèse, the girl who shared her lessons, her laughter, her reflection. And when you think about it, her story feels almost like a dream Versailles might have had if it could feel guilt. A brief vision of equality. Two children raised side by side without titles to separate them. A glimpse of the world France claimed to want, and then destroyed. Because in that nursery, long before the slogans of liberty and fraternity echoed through the streets, Marie Antoinette had already done something radical. She raised a noble's daughter and a servant's daughter together without asking the universe for permission. Of course, history forgot that part. It always does. And maybe that's fitting. Ernestine lived in the quiet corners of the story. The echo instead of the voice. The reflection instead of the flame. But she stayed loyal. She survived. And she carried the memory of a friendship that outlasted crowns and revolutions. So as the world outside turned sharper and louder, she kept her silence, and in doing so preserved the one thing the revolution never managed to destroy: the dignity of a quiet life. It's 1789, and the walls of Versailles are trembling. The perfume still lingers, but the air has changed. It's heavier now, thick with rumors and fear. The crowds outside the palace are no longer bowing, they're shouting. Inside, the Queen of France, tired and grieving, is still trying to hold on to the only part of her life that makes sense anymore: her children. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, another child enters her orbit. Her name is Jeanne-Louise Victoire, though everyone calls her Zoe. She's young, maybe 5 or 6, with pale curls and wide eyes that look far too calm for a child who has already lost everything. Both of her parents are dead, one to illness, the other to hunger. And through one of those strange twists of fate that history loves, she finds herself brought before the Queen. You can imagine the scene. A girl from the streets, standing in a hall lined with marble and gold, so overwhelmed by the brightness that she keeps her gaze fixed on the floor. The courtiers hover nearby, uncertain whether to sneer or bow. Marie Antoinette, as always, is dressed too finely for the moment. Silk, lace, pearls. But when she sees the child, her expression softens. She steps forward, kneels slightly so they're eye to eye, and says simply, "You're safe now." Zoe doesn't answer. She doesn't need to. In that instant, the queen does what she always does when she sees something small and fragile in a world built to crush it. She takes it in. It's an act that shocks absolutely no one who knows her, and yet surprises everyone who doesn't. France, of course, prefers its villains simple and its queens heartless. But Marie Antoinette is stubbornly difficult to categorize. She can be extravagant one moment and selfless the next. She spends fortunes on gowns and quietly pays dowries for poor girls in the same week. So when she takes this orphaned child into her household, no one quite knows whether to call it compassion or madness. Zoe, for her part, doesn't seem to mind either way. For a short time, she lives like a princess, or at least as close to one as a girl without a title ever could. She plays with Marie Therese, follows the royal children through the gardens, learns to read and write, and eats from plates she can probably see her own reflection in. The queen insists that she be treated kindly by the staff, though that instruction doesn't always survive the long chain of hierarchy that defines palace life. Still, Zoe thrives. For a few precious months, she has stability, warmth, and something dangerously close to love. But the illusion of safety doesn't last. The same year that brought Zoe into Versailles also brings the revolution to its gates. The palace that once glittered becomes a fortress surrounded by anger. The queen's days of charity are over. Now every act of kindness is rebranded as manipulation. Every orphan she shelters as a symbol of hypocrisy. The royal family is forced to flee to Paris, and once again, the quiet rhythms of childhood are shattered. Zoe can't go with them. She's too young, too vulnerable, and, though no one says it out loud, too expendable. The queen makes arrangements for her to be sent to a convent outside the city, where she'll be safe, educated, and, hopefully, forgotten by the mob. It's a strange kind of mercy, salvation disguised as abandonment. Marie Antoinette writes one final note to accompany her. "Care for this child as I would." And then, as the carriages roll away and the palace gates close behind them, Zoe disappears from view. That's where the record ends. No one knows exactly what became of her. There are traces, barely legible notes in church registers, rumors from convent archives, a few mentions in letters that crumble to dust before historians can finish arguing over them. Some say she grew up safely, took vows, and lived out her life in quiet service. Others claim she died young, caught in the chaos of the wars that followed. There's even a romantic legend that she survived, changed her name, and worked as a governess under an assumed identity, unaware that she'd once been loved by a queen. But the truth is simpler and sadder. She was a child swallowed by history, because while France was reinventing liberty, it was also forgetting the small and inconvenient. Records burned, names vanished, lives became statistics. Zoe wasn't royal enough to be remembered or rebellious enough to be romanticized. She was ordinary, which in the world of revolutions is the same as invisible. History lost track of her, which, to be fair, was a national hobby by then. And yet, she lingers somehow. Not in portraits or monuments, but in the faint edges of other stories, the letters of a queen who couldn't stop trying to mother the world, the brief lists of children formerly under royal care, the kind of bureaucratic footnotes that only historians and insomniacs ever bother to read. You almost feel her presence there, like a whisper between the lines. It's strange, isn't it? For all the fury the revolution unleashed, for all its promises to rebuild society, the people it forgot first were its smallest. The orphans, the voiceless, the children too quiet to matter. And Zoe, this little girl who vanished from paper and memory alike, was one of them. She's the kind of figure who reminds you that history isn't made of heroes and villains. It's made of fragments. The ones who live, the ones who die, and the ones who slip through the cracks without anyone noticing. Marie Antoinette would never learn what became of her. By the time the Queen stood trial, Zoe was already gone from her life, perhaps even from the world itself. But if she thought of her, and she must have in those long, cold nights in prison, she would have remembered the laughter, the innocence, the brief happiness of a child who knew her not as a queen, but simply as a woman kind enough to offer safety. That, in the end, might be the closest thing to immortality either of them ever received. One forgotten life preserved inside another's memory. And so, Zoe fades, not with tragedy or grandeur, but with the same quiet dignity she lived with. A small heartbeat drowned out by the roar of revolution. Before the revolution, before the mobs, before the echo of gunfire and chains, there was the nursery. It wasn't just a room, it was an entire world. A world trimmed in gold, perfumed with lavender, and so spotless it might as well have been carved from sugar. Here, in the most fragile corner of Versailles, the royal children lived their carefully orchestrated lives beneath ceilings painted with angels who always looked suspiciously well-fed. The sun rises, and the first sound is not laughter, but footsteps, the rustle of servants preparing the day. There are maids to open the curtains, tutors to check the lesson books, governesses to count how many spoons have gone missing since yesterday. By the time the children are awake, an entire battalion of attendants has already ensured that breakfast will be exactly as the etiquette manual demands. You wake to light pouring through embroidered drapes, the air faintly sweet from the rosewater sprinkled on the floorboards. A chambermaid stands beside your bed, whispering that it's time to rise. The sheets are smooth, the pillows smell faintly of starch and lavender, and even your yawn, yes, your yawn, must be performed gracefully. This is Versailles, after all, where decorum outweighs oxygen. There are rules for everything here: how to sit, how to blink, how to bow to the governess, and how to apologize if you don't bow with sufficient enthusiasm. Imagine being scolded for yawning incorrectly. The wrong kind of sigh could be a diplomatic incident. Breakfast arrives in perfect miniature: delicate rolls, fresh fruit, a cup of milk so frothy it could qualify as art. The governess watches as you take your first bite, not to ensure you're fed, but to make sure you chew in a way that reflects the dignity of the crown. The other children sit in a neat row, hands folded, hair brushed into submission. Even toddlers here are more disciplined than most generals. After breakfast, lessons begin. The tutors sweep in, powdered and perfumed, armed with scrolls and an alarming sense of importance. There's French grammar, because apparently being born French isn't qualification enough. Then music, tiny fingers pressed to the harpsichord, playing scales so delicate they sound like falling glass. Then drawing, etiquette, religion. Every subject designed not to free the mind, but to mold it. And yet, for all its stiffness, the nursery hums with something tender. The Queen visits often, ignoring the raised eyebrows of her attendants who think a mother's place is ceremonial. She sits beside her children, helping them with their lessons, adjusting a collar here, smoothing a curl there. Her laugh, light, unmistakable, breaks the monotony, and for a few brief moments the room feels less like a gilded cage and more like a home. Outside the nursery windows, the gardens stretch endlessly, fountains glittering, roses climbing up marble walls. When lessons end, the children spill out into that world of ordered beauty. They run along the paths, their laughter startling the swans, their governesses hurrying behind, warning them not to stain their lace cuffs or wrinkle their miniature coats. Marie-Thérèse, always composed, leads their games with quiet authority. Louis-Joseph, the first Dauphin, still frail but determined, insists on chasing butterflies even when he's too tired to catch them. Louis-Charles toddles behind, delighted by everything, a sunbeam in human form. Sophie, the baby, too small to join, watches from her cradle, gurgling at the commotion. And sometimes, among them, the adopted children, Armand, Ernestine, Jean Amilcar, little Zoe, join in, blurring the line between royal and common, at least until supper. It's strange how normal it all feels. Beneath the chandeliers and the ceremony, these are still just children, laughing too loudly, arguing over toys, begging for one more story before bed. When they pray, they clasp their hands with the same awkward sincerity every child has. When they cry, their tears fall just as quickly. The only difference is the audience. There's always an audience. Each day ends with a ritual of good manners. They bow to their tutors, thank their governess, kiss their mother's hand. It's part affection, part performance. Because in this palace, even bedtime has a protocol. The curtains are drawn, the candles dimmed, and lullabies drift through the air, soft, practiced, elegant. Outside, the crickets chirp in time with the distant murmur of fountains. For a while, this is how they live. In a rhythm so precise it could almost fool you into thinking it would last forever. And maybe that's the tragedy of it. How peaceful it all seems. How certain. How completely detached from the storm creeping closer with every passing day. Because while the children are learning to bow, Paris is learning to roar. The streets are filling with voices, voices that will never know what silk feels like, never eat bread without counting coins first. But in the nursery, those sounds haven't reached them yet. They are still wrapped in safety, still believing that chandeliers can keep out the dark. When the queen tucks them in, she looks at each face for a little too long. Perhaps she already senses what's coming, that soon there will be no carriages, no candles, no fountains, that the silk ribbons she ties around their wrists today will one day be replaced by iron shackles. But for now, she smiles. She hums a soft Austrian tune that no one else in France understands. And as you listen, you realize that this quiet artificial paradise is what makes everything that follows so unbearable. Because before the tragedy came, there was this: the laughter, the games, the little hands pressed together in prayer under ceilings painted with angels who would never descend to help them. The nursery at Versailles was both cradle and stage, the place where innocence rehearsed for heartbreak. If Versailles was a stage, then the Petit Trianon was Marie Antoinette's escape hatch, the one small corner of France where she could finally breathe without an audience. It sits tucked behind the grand gardens, hidden behind hedges and fountains, built decades earlier for another royal mistress and quietly inherited by a queen who was never meant to feel ordinary. It wasn't large by palace standards, which means it was still the size of a respectable modern hotel, but it was hers. No courtiers, no endless processions, no etiquette manuals thicker than the Bible. Just open windows, the sound of birds, and the laughter of children echoing across fields she pretended were wild. Here, for the first time, Marie Antoinette stopped being Her Majesty, the Queen of France, and became something far more dangerous: a person. In the mornings, she walked through the gardens in simple muslin gowns that scandalized the entire court. They called it shepherdess fashion, as though comfort were a moral failing. She picked flowers with her children, knelt to feed chickens, and scolded the gardeners for trimming the hedges too neatly. Versailles called her mad for it. But to her it was peace. Imagine it. No suffocating wigs, no corsets that require a team of engineers, no endless parade of sycophants pretending to faint at her smile. Just sunlight, soft grass underfoot, and the sound of her daughter giggling as she tried to milk a cow. The same courtiers who once accused her of extravagance now called her lazy for enjoying simplicity. Apparently, even motherhood was political if you were wearing a crown. The Petit Trianon became her sanctuary, her rebellion in plain sight. Within its walls, she wasn't the target of gossip or pamphlets, at least not immediately. She was just maman, sitting cross-legged on the floor, while her children played with wooden toys instead of gilded ones. The little Dauphin, Louis Joseph, rode his tiny pony around the gardens. Marie-Thérèse organized tea parties with her dolls. Louis Charles toddled through flower beds, picking more dirt than daisies. Marie would laugh, genuinely, not the polite Versailles version. For a few years she managed the impossible. She turned royalty into something that looked suspiciously like happiness. But of course, France didn't see it that way. From the outside, the Petit Trianon looked like everything people hated about her: privilege, isolation, the illusion of innocence bought with public money. The newspapers printed caricatures of her dressed as a milkmaid, mocking her toy village and accusing her of playing peasant while real peasants starved. They didn't care that the estate was built long before her reign, or that she used it mostly to escape the suffocating absurdity of court life. In the public imagination, she became Madame Deficit, a woman too self-absorbed to care about her country's suffering. The irony, of course, is that she had spent more money on hospitals and orphanages than most of her critics combined. But Versailles gossip didn't run on facts. It ran on envy. And nothing provoked envy quite like a woman trying to live on her own terms. Inside the Petit Trianon, her motherhood bloomed quietly. She read to her children, tended to their fevers, and insisted that they be treated with kindness rather than discipline, a revolutionary idea in a palace that considered affection a weakness. Her letters from this period reveal a gentleness completely at odds with her public image. "My children," she wrote once, "are my happiness, and without them, life would be intolerable." When her first son fell ill, she nursed him herself, sitting for hours at his bedside despite the protests of courtiers who thought such things beneath a queen. When he died in 1789, her sanctuary lost its light. The gardens grew quiet. She still walked them, but her steps were slower, her face thinner. The woman who once laughed among roses now looked like she was carrying the weight of the whole country, which, in a way, she was. The Petit Trianon became less a refuge and more a memory. The revolution was already spreading like a fever. The same people who once cheered for her children's births now shouted for her downfall. Pamphlets that once mocked her clothes now called for her blood. And through it all, she still tried to keep her children close, still whispered lullabies when the world outside was screaming for vengeance. It's hard not to see the cruel symmetry of it all. The woman demonized for being heartless punished precisely for having a heart. Versailles never understood her. To them, she was either too frivolous or too serious, too proud or too maternal, too foreign, too French, too everything except what they wanted her to be at any given hour. The Petit Trianon, for all its simplicity, was her quiet protest, a reminder that she was human in a world that demanded perfection and punished sincerity. Her critics said she played at being a shepherdess. Maybe she did. But maybe that was the only way she could survive the suffocating performance of being queen. You can imagine her in those final months before the storm, walking the garden paths at dusk, her children beside her, the sound of distant music drifting from the palace. She stops to breathe in the scent of lavender, closes her eyes, and for a moment, it almost feels normal, almost peaceful. The servants bow, the fountains murmur, the world beyond the hedges is already burning. But for a few minutes, she doesn't have to see it. And when the children run ahead, laughing in the last light of day, she smiles. Not because she believes it will last, but because for a heartbeat, it does. That was the cruel genius of Versailles. It gave her everything except the ability to keep it. Later, when she's dragged from her sanctuary, when the Petit Trianon is stripped and looted, when the crowds finally break through the gates, they'll sneer at her, Little Eden. They'll say she built it to escape her duties, to hide from the suffering of her people. But they'll be wrong. She built it to remember she was a person, before the crown, before the hatred, before the history books turned her into a villain. If you look at what remains of it today, the paint faded, the gardens quiet. You can almost still hear her laughter, faint but stubborn, the sound of someone clinging to gentleness in a world that was running out of it. Because in the end, Marie Antoinette's greatest rebellion wasn't against politics or poverty or even revolution. It was against the idea that a queen couldn't be a mother. If you enjoy what I do here, subscribe. Else, this channel won't be shown to you again. You wake to the sound of metal, not the bright ring of silver trays or clockwork toys, but something colder, heavier, the creak of an iron door. For a moment, in that half-light between sleep and memory, you almost expect the curtains of Versailles, the rustle of silk, the murmur of a servant saying it's time for lessons. But when you open your eyes, there's only gray stone and the smell of damp straw. The revolution has swallowed everything bright. The palace, the gardens, the fountains, gone. The chandeliers are dark, the mirrors broken, the laughter long forgotten. You're not in Versailles anymore. You're in the temple. It used to be a fortress for knights. Now it's a prison for children. The queen, once surrounded by courtiers and candles, now shares her days with shadows. Her husband is gone. Her son, the little boy who once clung to her hand and called her maman, is locked in another cell. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, sits beside her, quiet, still, too old for her years. There are no clocks here, only the rhythm of the guards' boots on stone. Every sound echoes. Every whisper feels like it travels miles before dying in the walls. The queen prays aloud sometimes, not because she expects salvation, but because silence feels like surrender. The days blur together. Morning is just the moment the gray becomes lighter gray. Meals are delivered without ceremony. Thin soup, stale bread, sometimes a piece of meat, if the guards are feeling charitable. Once, she would have sent back such food untouched. Now, she thanks them. Revolution has a way of re-educating the palate. At night, she listens for the sounds she can't bear not to hear. the small cough from her son's cell above, the shuffle of her daughter turning over on her cot. Each faint noise is a heartbeat she can't reach, and then the noises stop. The guards tell her she's not to see her son anymore. The order comes down without warning, without explanation. She pleads, she weeps. She's told he's being re-educated. The word feels like poison. Upstairs, the boy, Louis Charles, doesn't understand why his mother doesn't come anymore. The men who replace her speak to him in rough voices, promising him freedom if he says the right things. He's too young to realize that freedom has been redefined. He cries for her at first, then whispers to her when he thinks no one's listening. "Good night, maman." After a while, even that fades. In the lower cell, the queen learns to live with that silence. It becomes her lullaby. Every day she writes imaginary letters to her children, small fragments of love scrawled on scraps of memory. Be good, be brave, remember who you are. She doesn't know if they'll ever read them. She writes anyway, because writing is a form of breathing, and breathing is the one act of rebellion left to her. Marie Thérèse, at 14, becomes her mother's comfort and caretaker. Together they sew, pray, read from the only books the guards will allow. Sometimes they talk about nothing, flowers, music, their walks at the Petit Trianon. They speak softly because memories now feel like contraband. When the king is executed, they hear the cannon from their cell. The queen doesn't scream. She closes her eyes, clasps her daughter's hand, and whispers, "Your father is at peace." Then she turns away, because peace is not something she can look at yet. Months pass. The air in the temple grows colder. The guards change faces, uniforms, tempers. Some are cruel, some are simply afraid. A few avert their eyes when the queen walks by, not out of hatred, but shame. They see her not as a monarch now, but as a woman who has lost everything except her dignity. She starts to age quickly, like grief itself has turned her to glass. Her gowns, once stitched by royal seamstresses, hang loose. Her hands are thin, her eyes hollow, but strangely clear. She's no longer performing for the world, not the court, not the crowds, not even the future. Every gesture, every word is stripped bare. By the summer of 1793, the rumors grow louder. The guards whisper about a trial, about moving her to another prison. The temple's walls seem to hold their breath. When the order comes, it's almost merciful. She's to be transferred to the conciergerie, the antechamber to the guillotine. They separate her from her daughter that night. No warning, no goodbye. Just footsteps in the dark, a door opening, hands pulling her away. Marie Thérèse screams her name as the cell door slams shut. The queen looks back only once. "Courage, my child," she says. "Courage and faith." At the conciergerie, time ceases to exist altogether. The walls sweat. The straw smells of mold. The single window is barred so thickly it barely admits light. She's watched constantly, even when she sleeps, even when she prays. The guards call her the Widow Capet, stripping her name of its crown, its meaning, its past. And yet, strangely, there's peace in that too. She no longer has to pretend. No more salons, no more silks, no more scripts, just her and the quiet, which at times feels almost like forgiveness. Each day, she waits for news. Each night, she dreams of her children. In her dreams, they're running through the gardens of Versailles again, sunlight in their hair, laughter trailing behind them like ribbons. But when she wakes, there's only the gray. The silence presses in like a second skin. She writes one last letter before her trial, a testament to the woman she's become. It's not political, not defensive. It's maternal. She forgives her enemies. She blesses her children. She writes, "I die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion of my fathers. I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me." She signs it calmly, the pen trembling only once, on the word mother. In the cell next door, another prisoner will later say that at night you could hear her praying, softly, rhythmically, as if trying to weave her words into the walls themselves. The prayers never changed. Always for her son, always for her daughter, always for the strength to endure what comes next. By the time dawn touches the Seine, she's ready. When they come for her, she stands without help. The guards hesitate, not because they pity her, but because something about her composure unnerves them. She walks past them without looking back. In the corridor, the air smells faintly of iron and rain. It's the same sound she's heard every morning in prison. The creak of doors, the footsteps, the rhythm of inevitability. And somewhere, far above her, in a locked room of the temple, her son stirs in his sleep, calling softly for a mother who will never answer again. The silence that follows is not cruel anymore. It's just final. When a story ends too brutally, people start inventing softer versions. That's how myths begin, as bandages for history. After the guillotine fell silent, after the monarchy was buried under the rubble of its own grandeur, France was left with ghosts. They haunted the country for centuries, not just the royal ones, but the ones made of rumor, longing, and denial. And no ghost was more persistent than that of the lost Dauphin. Louis Charles, the little boy who died alone in a cell in 1795, became too tragic to accept and too symbolic to forget. France, still hung over from its own revolution, couldn't stand to believe it had let a 10-year-old die of neglect. So almost immediately, the story began to splinter. Some whispered that he had been rescued. Others claimed he'd been smuggled out by loyalists in the dead of night, replaced with another child who perished in his place. The Queen's enemies said it was all divine punishment, that the boy's suffering was necessary for justice. Her supporters said it was a lie, that the true heir to France was alive somewhere, waiting. It was a comforting thought. France, after all, loves its symbols. And there's something appealing about the idea of innocence surviving revolution, of purity escaping the guillotine's reach. Within a few decades, the myth had taken on a life of its own. By the early 1800s, self-proclaimed Louis XVI claimants began popping up across Europe like mushrooms after rain. By the end of the century, there would be more than 100 of them. One appeared in Germany, insisting he'd been raised in secret by royalists and that he could still remember the smell of the Tuileries nursery. Another emerged in Italy, claiming to possess the true knowledge of Versailles. In Canada, a man named Eleazar Williams, of all places, told anyone who'd listen that he was the lost Dauphin, spirited away across the Atlantic as a child. He even convinced a few people, which says a lot about the 19th century and its relationship with common sense. Every imposter came armed with the same essentials: a mysterious scar, a suspicious birth certificate, and an excellent memory for trivia about royal life. Some even went so far as to mimic the boy's supposed handwriting, or faintly recall the smell of lavender from his mother's perfume. And people believed them, not because the evidence was convincing, but because the truth was unbearable. It's easier to imagine the child escaping through secret tunnels than to picture him dying nameless in a filthy cell. The mind recoils from that kind of horror, so it builds an escape hatch, one lie at a time. Even Napoleon got in on the act, claiming that one of the pretenders might be real. Because why not? If you're busy rewriting the entire French political order, what's one more revision of history? For the royalists still clinging to their fading cause, these claimants became living relics, proof that the monarchy's bloodline, however broken, still flowed somewhere out there. For the revolutionaries, they were nuisances, embarrassments, reminders that even the greatest upheaval in Europe's history couldn't kill a good conspiracy theory. The truth, though, stayed exactly where it always had, sealed away in a jar. When Louis Charles's body was finally exhumed after his death in 1795, one of the doctors, struck by pity or curiosity or both, removed his heart during the autopsy. It was a strange act, but not an uncommon one in the 18th century. People were oddly sentimental about organs back then. The doctor, Philippe Jean Pelletan, supposedly placed it in a glass jar filled with spirits and kept it as a kind of morbid keepsake. Perhaps he thought it might one day serve as proof. Perhaps he just couldn't bear to discard it. Over the next 2 centuries, the heart passed through more hands than the French crown itself. It was stolen during riots, recovered, lost again, donated to churches, rediscovered in dusty cabinets, and mislabeled more than once. It became a relic, not of sainthood, but of sorrow. And then in the year 2000, more than 200 years after the revolution, science did what sentiment never could. The preserved heart was tested using DNA from living descendants of Marie Antoinette's family line, specifically from her sister's lineage. The results were clear. The heart belonged to her son, Louis Charles. The lost Dauphin hadn't escaped. He hadn't been smuggled away to foreign shores or grown up under a new name. He had died exactly where history said he did, alone, terrified, and forgotten. It took 2 centuries, a few hundred impostors, and a heart in a jar to prove the revolution really was that heartless. But somehow even that revelation didn't kill the myth. Because myths, once born, don't die. They just fade into background noise, whispering to anyone still awake enough to listen. You can still find his story scattered across Europe. Plaques claiming the true Louis XVII lived here, museums with dusty portraits of pretenders, family trees drawn with shaky hands by descendants who are either delusional or very optimistic. In every version, the details change: the ship, the rescuer, the country. But the longing stays the same. It's the longing for redemption, for the idea that something good must have survived the carnage, that maybe, just maybe, France's revolution didn't eat all of its children. But the heart doesn't lie. It sits today in Saint Denis Cathedral, beside his parents, entombed with the dignity he never had in life. The marble around it gleams in the half-light, and the air smells faintly of incense and dust. A strange blend of holiness and history. Tourists shuffle through quietly, whispering without knowing why. Maybe they sense what it really represents. Not royalty, not politics, but the unbearable fragility of innocence. For a moment, you can almost imagine her there too, the mother who once held that heart against her own, the queen who sang lullabies beneath chandeliers, who fed chickens at Petit Trianon, who kissed her son's forehead and told him to be brave. She didn't live to see his name cleared, but perhaps somewhere the echo of it reached her anyway. That's the irony of history. It doesn't care how long it takes to tell the truth, only that someone's still around to listen when it's finally spoken. And so, more than 200 years later, A small, preserved heart became proof not only of a boy's death, but of a woman's love. Love that outlasted kingdoms, revolutions, and rumor. Because even when France forgot, her son's heart remembered. When the revolution was over and the shouting finally stopped, there was only one child left standing. Marie Thérèse Charlotte, the firstborn, the one who watched her world collapse from inside a locked room, emerged into a France that no longer remembered how to say her name with kindness. She was 21 when she walked out of the temple prison, pale, silent, and already older than her years. They called her Madame Royale, the daughter of France. But she was also the daughter of ghosts. Her father was gone, her mother executed, her brothers buried or lost. Every face she had once known existed now only in portraits. She carried their absence like luggage, heavy, familiar, impossible to set down. When she left France, she didn't look back. She boarded a carriage bound for Austria, and as the gates of Paris faded behind her, so did the girl who had once fed swans in the ponds of Versailles. What remained was something quieter, harder. The revolution had taught her many things: how to survive hunger, loneliness, imprisonment, but never how to mourn in public. She spent her first months of freedom trying to relearn the idea of safety. In Vienna, her mother's family welcomed her with tears and formal condolences, but there was a strangeness to it all, as though they were comforting a monument, not a person. She was treated gently, reverently, like a relic of a world that no longer existed. When she smiled, people called it miraculous. When she didn't, they called it tragedy. Either way, she belonged to history now, not herself. The question of what to do with her was diplomatic as much as personal. Royal blood was currency, and Marie Thérèse was one of the last drops in circulation. In 1799, she was married to her cousin, Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, a man as gentle as he was unremarkable, which in her case was probably a blessing. Their union was arranged to restore the Bourbon dynasty, to stitch together the shreds of a monarchy that had already bled out. She did her duty, as always. She smiled when expected, attended ceremonies, bore no children. The marriage was companionable, but distant, not loveless, just muted. They were both survivors of an era that had little patience for joy. For a brief, flickering moment in 1830, she was technically Queen of France, though only for about 20 minutes. Her father-in-law, King Charles the Cao, abdicated in favor of his son, Louis Antoine, who in turn abdicated almost immediately under pressure from the July Revolution. It was monarchy's shortest encore. A crown passed to her, then vanished before she could even adjust its weight. And yet, in a strange way, it suited her. Marie Thérèse had spent a lifetime running from the stage. She didn't crave power. What she wanted was peace, something her birthright had denied her since the day she opened her eyes. After her brief taste of kingship, she and her husband went into exile again, this time to Scotland, then Prague, and finally to a quiet estate in Austria. It was there, far from the noise of politics, that she began the long process of simply existing. She filled her days with routine, morning prayers, letters to distant cousins, walks in gardens that probably reminded her of Versailles, though she never said so aloud. She read books of devotion, mended clothes, and hosted small dinners where the conversation never strayed too close to memory. Visitors said she was kind, dignified, but distant, as though she lived behind a pane of glass. They would try to speak of her past, and she would smile politely and change the subject. She learned to live with ghosts, one friend said later. She just never learned to talk about them. And how could she? How do you put into words what it's like to watch your entire world executed before you've learned what the word future means? Her letters, the few that survive, are full of restraint, gratitude, duty, faith. But every so often, a crack appears, a line about the children who were with us in the gardens, a reference to her mother's gentleness, much misunderstood. These are the fragments that hint at the ache beneath the composure. She avoided portraits later in life, preferring to remain unpainted. The images that do survive show a woman with a composed mouth and haunted eyes, the kind that have seen too much to expect kindness from time. Her hair is powdered white long before her age requires it. The lines around her eyes aren't just from years, they're from memory. She outlived them all, her siblings, her cousins, her uncles, the impostors, even the revolutionaries who once celebrated her family's death. She outlived entire regimes. Napoleon rose and fell. Kings returned, then fled again. And through it all, she endured, the last living echo of a dynasty that refused to stay buried. When she died in 1851, at the age of 72, France was on its second empire. The world had changed beyond recognition. Trains cut through the countryside where her carriage had once jolted along dirt roads. The Palace of Versailles was no longer a home, but a museum, a monument to everything she had lost. Her funeral was quiet, attended mostly by aging monarchists who still whispered about destiny and divine right. But there were no children there, no heirs, no family to carry her story forward. She was, quite literally, the end of a bloodline. And yet, maybe that was the point. Her life had never been about continuation. It was about endurance. She had survived when no one else did, not because of politics or power, but because survival was the only rebellion left to her. Imagine her in those final years, walking slowly through a dim corridor, pausing before a window as the light fades. The world outside has moved on, but she still listens for echoes, the laughter of her brothers, her mother's voice, the sound of fountains from the gardens of Versailles. It's all gone now, of course, but in her memory, it plays like a lullaby from another life. She sits by the fire, hands folded, her rosary glinting in the light. Perhaps she prays not for forgiveness, but for peace, for herself, for her family, for a France that never decided whether to love her or hate her. And in that stillness, you realize that the story doesn't end in the blood and fury of the revolution. It ends here, with an old woman who has learned to carry history quietly, the way some people carry grief, not as a wound, but as a shadow. Because in the end, Marie Therese didn't rebuild a kingdom. She didn't rewrite her story. She simply survived it. The palace sleeps now, Versailles, that glittering, impossible world of gold and mirrors, finally quiet. The corridors that once rang with footsteps and gossip have gone still. Dust settles where courtiers once bowed. The chandeliers are dark. Even the fountains outside seem to whisper softer, as though mourning something they can no longer remember. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. Not the kings or the generals, not the revolutionaries or the mobs, but the smaller voices, the ones history misplaced, the children, their laughter faint in the nursery air, their footsteps fading down marble halls. History remembers wars. It remembers treaties, crowns, executions. It rarely remembers lullabies. But in this quiet, they linger. Marie sewing by candlelight, a little boy whispering for his mother through stone walls, a daughter walking through exile with ghosts for company. Versailles was built to be eternal, but eternity has a short attention span. The walls forget, the portraits fade, and the stories that mattered most slip through the cracks. Not the rise and fall of empires, but the small acts of love that made surviving them possible. Tonight, though, you remembered. Maybe you didn't mean to. Maybe you just wanted something to help you sleep. But somewhere between the flicker of the candles and the sound of your own breathing, you joined the tiny handful of people in the world who still remember these children existed. That Marie Antoinette was more than a crown and a guillotine. That she was a mother who lost everything and kept loving anyway. If you're still awake, do me a favor by subscribing. That's the only way to let me know that what I do here matters. Good night from Versailles. The chandeliers are dark now, and the forgotten children finally rest. And as you drift off tonight, remember, you can take these stories with you, ad-free, anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at a time, and the link is waiting in both the description and the pinned comment. And before you drift away completely, thank you for being here, for staying, for listening. Every time you watch, comment, or share one of these stories, you keep this strange, sleepy corner of history alive. You're not just supporting a channel, you're helping the past find its voice again. Sleep well. History can wait until morning.